Okay, today we're going to talk about 26-3, living through the Depression and what that was like. So, women had some changes during this time. Some did take jobs. It was a hard time that, a lot of people didn't think it was appropriate for women to take the jobs when men didn't have jobs. But also, some families were desperate to take any jobs they could get, and even though women made less than men, so it was a hard, thing to navigate for women. So many did take jobs, or they would start their own businesses on the side to try to make extra money, like taking in other people's laundry to do it, or starting boarding houses, right? Letting people live in their house, renting a room. Also, they tried to do whatever they could to keep the family going by doing more themselves, right? Like sewing their own clothes and canning their own vegetables and things, trying to save money. Um, so, even though it's such a hard time for women, there are some women who really stand out as leaders. Frances Perkins, this is her picture right here, the Time magazine. She was the first ever woman cabinet member. Roosevelt was pretty progressive in that way, that he had about 100 different women in posts in his government. And this Frances Perkins was the Secretary of Labor, and she was very instrumental, and he listened to her, and she got a lot done. Also, of course, we mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt before, that she took a kind of changed what it was like to be the First Lady. She was very active because her husband had trouble traveling, right, with his disability. She ended up being like the eyes and ears for him, and would go on these fact-finding trips herself and come back with the information. And she got very active and became a strong voice for both women and families in general who are in need. So she is kind of held up as one of the most famous first ladies. All right, so the Dust Bowl. This is an environmental disaster that happens in the 30s. It was partly, human made. In the Great Plains states, in the southern part, um, these states, farmers have been clearing the land and using all this new technology we have to get rid of all of the sod, and not realizing that if you get rid of all the grass, right, that's what keeps the soil down. And so they clear it all to farm, and then unfortunately there's a big drought in 1931, and the soil, the crops obviously die and all the soil dries up, and then unfortunately big windstorms in the prairie happen, right? And so they come and blow the soil away. So these big huge blizzards are called black blizzards, right? These dust storms that, look at the pictures, they're ridiculously big. They move the soil away from where you want it into places you don't want it. It actually blocked the sun. You can see the drifts would get up to like 6 feet. There were some buildings that were partially covered. You can see here this car is right almost all the way covered. So it was a disaster. And of course, many farmers go bankrupt during this time, and then there's even more people out of work. And so about 400,000 people migrate to California. They are hearing, they're no longer able to farm, so many of them become migrant workers, right? People who go to pick up crops for other people, and that's how they're hoping to make a living, because they're starving and they've lost their own farms. And so quite a few people move west. They were nicknamed Okies after the state of Oklahoma that many of them are from, although of course not all of them are from Oklahoma, but those states around there. And so that is, again, a huge migration of people, all like desperately searching. You can see that picture on the right. People are very, very poor, and trying to just get jobs however they can. Okay. All right, let's talk about how minorities are treated during this time. Just like we've talked about in other times of stress in history, unfortunately, people take it out on the minorities, right? So as there's more and more competition for jobs, um, people, the white people start taking the other minorities' jobs because they're so desperate, right? And so African Americans, of course, are unemployed by a large number. More than half of all African Americans are estimated to have been out of work. Many of them try to go to the north, right? There's that big migration time when they're looking for work in the north. They do not fare much better looking for work in the north. But there were some positives that came out of the 30s. The NAACP was born during this time, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and they try to fight discrimination in getting jobs, and they help the African Americans to join labor unions. Remember, we talked previously about how unions would leave out and not let minorities in. So this group kind of really helped to advance the rights for colored people. That's what they call them then, right? African Americans. And again, Roosevelt shows he's pretty progressive. He listens to African Americans. He gives them jobs in the federal government. There's a group of them that he gave positions to in the federal government, and he really did listen to their advice. So they're called his Black Cabinet, is the nickname. Also, his wife, Eleanor, was also, right, always looking for injustice. And there's this story about Marian Anderson. She's singing there in front of Lincoln Hall because she had been refused at a private Constitution Hall performance, and they wouldn't let her because she was African American. So she pulled strings and made sure, Eleanor Roosevelt, that she got her own concert, and it was a big deal. Okay. All right, Native Americans are also, of course, struggling widespread poverty during this time. However, they also had some good things during the 30s. During Roosevelt's term, there was someone in charge of the Bureau of Indian Affairs called John Collier, and he made what they nicknamed like the Indian New Deal because they did a lot to help Indian or Native American rights. They stopped selling the reservation land away from them, right? They were supposed to, that's supposed to be their land. They helped get the Native Americans jobs in the Civilian Conservation Corps. Remember, we talked about them last time. Also, the Public Works Administration, which we talked about previously, helped get money to build their own schools on their reservations. And then, probably most importantly, there was the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which helped give the power back to the Native Americans themselves. It restored their tribal governments, and it helped give some money back so they could make their reservations larger and better. So that was a decent, good amount of things that are happening for the Native Americans. Latinos are also unfortunately a target during this time, right? Unemployment is spreading. People resent them and they don't want them to, have competition for their jobs. So much so that the government starts encouraging Mexican American immigrants to go back to Mexico. Some places would give them a one-way train ticket back, or often they would round them up and ship them across the border in train cars, not by their wishes. Okay, so about 500,000 Mexican Americans left during the Great Depression, but many against their will. Because, Americans didn't want to compete for jobs against them. And they also faced discrimination, the ones that were there. They would be turned away when they come to the hospital or schools. They were not, do you remember how they were giving like money and relief payments to people who were out of work? They would be either outright turned away, or they'd come up with some, black, tape that would keep them, red tape that keep them, from getting the money. Also, there was they would try to organize their labor unions, but of course the owners of the companies and people in government would like actively make sure that they couldn't, right? So there's a lot of discrimination against them. Okay, so because everything is so hard, often people tend to turn to radical ideas because they feel like things aren't going so poorly, right? So you can understand that those socialist and communist ideas that we've talked about before may seem popular because, right, the economy we have is so bad. So they're saying, see, this system doesn't work, having this free market. We need to get more involved and be socialist or communist. So there were some U.S. Followers of communism because of that, and also they're not only promising to fix the economy, but also all the racial injustice. Although those numbers grow, of course, it doesn't dominate and overthrow democracy or anything like that in the United States. Another major thing that's happening in the 30s is the rise of fascism. Now, in the United States, it never becomes so big that it takes over like it does in Europe, but there are groups of fascists in the United States too. So you should know what fascist is. A fascist is, or a fascism is a political philosophy that stresses the glory of the state over the individual and favors dictators. So you will see this picture is showing you that this happened in Europe, that numerous countries start being ruled by these dictators who are definitely not caring about the individual's rights and more about a strong government. So Germany, of course, has Hitler. We will get into all that a little bit later. And that's Mussolini on the left there. Italy had Mussolini. Also, Spain's having an issue right now with a fascist group winning in a civil war that's happening in Spain. So there's a lot of fascism happening in the 30s. Not as much in the United States, luckily, although, like I said, those ideas are still around in the US, and some people do believe them, and there's a lot of backlash. Fascists tend to blame a certain group for the problems. As you know, Hitler blamed the Jews, right? And also the communists. So Jews, communists, liberals, that same idea is blamed on what's happening in the United States, is blamed on them, just not to the huge level that, we see in Europe. And we'll get to that. Okay. Just so you know what's going on in the 30s overall, all those terrible things that are happening does influence our entertainment. There's basically two trends that are happening in the 30s. Escapism, right? You want something to distract you from your problems. So it's light, happy, or romantic ideas, right? Or you could go another way, which is social criticism, right? Showing the injustice or suffering that's happening in this era that, right? So, and, maybe, trying to get people to change it. Okay, so the radio becomes really big during this time period. Remember, you don't have television yet, so you are listening to a radio show. Okay, and so the daytime dramas become very popular. We call them soap operas today. That name started back in the 30s because it was very typical for the daytime drama to be have advertisements of laundry detergent during the radio show, so they became kind of like nicknamed a soap opera. Also, a different adventure radio shows were very popular. Dick Tracy is I don't know if you've ever seen Dick Tracy, but more like detective stories. And then Superman, of course, becomes a very, very, very big adventure story. So those are going to help distract people from their real life, right? Also, there were comedians, different comedy shows that became popular during this time. And they mention a few of the famous ones: George Burns, Gracie Allen, and Jack Benny. I don't know if you've ever heard of any of them. They're kind of older, but you might have. I know you've probably seen these movies. Walt Disney started with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937, and then The Wizard of Oz in 1939. And these are going to distract people, right? They're colorful. The Wizard of Oz is a musical and has like a good message, right? So it helps like uplift people's spirits. And then on the other side, talking about the drama of life, right? The Grapes of Wrath is one of those social criticism kind of things. The movie is based on the famous novel by Steinbeck about the Dust Bowl. So that's what that picture is, those people being Okies trying to move and survive what's happening with the Dust Bowl. So that one's a dramatic one. And then I don't know if you've ever seen Gone with the Wind. It also is based, this film, on a novel by Margaret Mitchell. It is actually set in the Civil War, but it's a lot similar about like suffering and trying to go through economic hard times. And there's also some, racial injustice things in there. And of course, it's framed as like a romance, and there is, drama with romance, but of course, there's all that social commentary behind it. And your book kind of went into detail talking about a bunch of different writers and photographers and painters who also did other things during the Depression. I don't think you need to memorize all of them, so I didn't put them in the screencast today. But obviously there are a lot more. Those were the two trends are throughout the 30s.